welcome to Monday. And here we go. So, on your homework over the weekend, the objects that I asked you to focus on and to draw, I'm asking you to look at them as I'm asking you to look at them in this way, this very particular way, where it's a structural approach to drawing, and we're looking for cubes or cylinders or spheres that can describe these objects and take us 90% of the way there, create the perspective, create the proportions, and the general shape of the objects. Okay, some of you guys are doing pretty good with that, and I feel like all of us can use a certain amount of development right here. So this is a place that I think is worth some extra focus. Okay, and so I've got a couple of ideas that I want to try to bring to you guys. So the first idea is I want to start to make the geometry a little bit more important by starting to give it some names, okay? So for instance, I'd like to call all the lines going left to right on an object, I'd like to call these X's, okay? And all the lines going up and down, I'd like to call these Y. And all the lines that go back in space, I'd like to call that a Z. And so what we want to do is we want to work to, let me see, what we want to do is we want to work to coordinate those lines. So if I'm drawing a cube, I'll start out with my X's, okay? Those are a couple of X's. And now I'm going to put in a Y. Here's a Y. Here's a Y. And now I'll go for a Z. There's a Z. And there's a Z. Okay, I'm going to throw in the back Y. The top X. Here's an X. There's an X. Okay, the top X. And now to complete this is the back Z. Okay, there's a Z. And then we have the invisibles. Like, so we think of this as being a glass box, okay? And now on the interior of the box, and you want to draw these lines lighter, you could even make them kind of feel like dots, but that's a Y. That's an X right there. And there is our final Z. And I'll darken in a little bit here. And I'll darken in a little bit here. Right there is one place I've got a little bit of a weakness. Okay, now if this is the end of the box that's closer to me, here's the closer end, and over here is the further end, okay? If I project these lines out and I make little arrows like this, if I project these out and I make little arrows, on the far side, the idea has to be that on the far side of that box, that these arrows would all converge in space, that at some point these arrows would meet over here. At some point they would come together. So over here you'll notice if I project an arrow, and if I project an arrow, and if I project an arrow, you know, these arrows will never meet in space. These arrows, if you run into these arrows 3 feet off the page, they're going to become further and further and further apart. But these arrows here, on the far side arrows start to converge in space. Okay. Now the same is true in the Z, right? So with this one and this one, these two arrows, as these two, this is the far side now, and this is the close side. And so as these two arrows move out in space, they'll eventually converge, okay? And I want to introduce another set of concepts now with regards to understanding structural drawing. Okay, it becomes very important for us. Cross sections start to become really important for us. So here's a cross section, and in medical terminology, this cross section is called sagittal. Okay, and I split the form in two along what's called a sagittal boundary. Okay. Now this has the possibility of being in perspective and also of being out of perspective. And I'd like for these lines to stay kind of light. Okay, so that is a sagittal section. And it forms a really important cross contour line. And it's as important as every other line on the cube. You'll notice that this part right here, you see that point? It sets it up so that this part is bigger than that part, meaning it's incorrect. Meaning that this has to move to about there. Maybe a little bit more. Yeah, a little bit more is even better. And then this has to move to here, and that has to move to there, okay? And this really sets you up for some really nice perspective. Okay, so that's the sagittal section, okay? The next section that I want to introduce is the transverse section. And that's a line that goes this way. Okay, that's a plane. And again, from here to here. And this, now that I've introduced the transverse section down there, I can see that my front needs to come down a little bit further, just a tiny bit further there. Okay, and here's the transverse section. So it's going through this, and you're seeing it's starting to become a really complicated little shape, right? Here, where the sagittal and transverse meet, we can draw a line too. So this has like 4 little glass boxes set up on top of one another. You ever see glass bricks? This is like 4 little glass bricks all set on top of one another. And then the last section is called coronal, okay, and here it is. So if you have like the carotid artery, it's the outside. A corona on something is like a halo that goes around the outside of it. And then, of course, there's Corona beer, which you're supposed to drink outside. Okay. So that's the corona, okay? And it's the practice of these added sections, these 3 added sections, that starts to give our drawings a structural integrity, okay? And it applies also with the cylinder. So if we work with a cylinder, we start out and we sketch the best cylinder we can. And here's the minor axis. And there's the minor axis. Okay, and so side A has to be symmetrical to side B. Again, side A has to be symmetrical to side B. The lower portion will be bigger because it's further from eye level, right? Okay. And so we can apply the same thinking to this. We can put a sagittal cross section. I'm going to do it right here. And now that I've done that, that will reveal to me how in perspective I am. You see, because the close edge here has to be smaller, has to be bigger than the back section, right? 2 arrows coming off of this. would have to converge in space. They couldn't. So what this is showing me is that I have a mistake. And if I lower this right there, and then I take this and move it. Now you see how the arrows coming out the back end would in fact converge in space. This is not straight. And so I worked out with a quick little check, I was able to see that's a way of checking on the soundness of my cylinder. Okay, so that's my sagittal section. And here's my transverse section. If I mark halfway on this line, and I mark halfway on this line, and I mark halfway on this line, and halfway on this line, and halfway on this line. So that gives me all these points to hit. With an ellipse. And that gives me a transverse section. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go for the coronal. The corona. Okay, and I'm going to put the corona at 90 degrees to the sagittal. And we draw through. Okay. And now if we're drawing reasonably, if we're starting to get a little bit of practice and we're starting to draw better, if we're drawing reasonably, the space starts to look like constructible, right? It starts to feel constructed, and it starts to inform ideas that we could shapes. It starts to suggest shapes. You know, we could make shapes by subtraction. We could make shapes by addition. We're capable of dividing this shape into multiple spaces evenly, so we could draw mechanical things. We can draw daily objects. Okay, so let's look at a sphere. Let's do the same process with a sphere. Here's a sphere. Okay, and a lot of times when we immediately impose an ellipse onto a sphere that we've drawn, and that ellipse that we impose is in fact the transverse section. And then if we go from the back of it to the front of it, and we do another ellipse now, and from that would not be a line of symmetry, that back to the front. And the circle that was the initial circle is the corona, the line that we put for the original sphere that we designed. So we've got the transverse section, the sagittal section, and the coronal section, okay? Now let's take on one of the objects that you guys were drawing, and let's add this to it, okay? So let's go back to where you were. Let's take on the cupcake, for instance. So a cupcake could start with a cylinder. Over the cylinder, there's a cone. And in order to find the cone, I'm going to find the minor axis. And I'm going to cross the minor axis to help me find the center. So here's the center. So I bring a cone upwards like that. Over the cone it stretches. I want to go upwards again, and the cone has another cone that kind of rides over the top of that cone. And here there's another ellipse. And this one, okay, this one happened to be divided into colors. 1, 2, 3, and then there's a sphere. There's a cherry on top. All right, now the bottom actually is a cone. The bottom is actually not a cylinder, but I can use the cylinder that I've started with, and I can just make it a little bit smaller. Put an ellipse in here. One, two, okay. Let's clean this. Okay. And now let's impose a sagittal section on this. I can go like this and down and across the form and up to the back of the form, wherever I would find the back of the form, right about there. Okay, now I'm going to come up and over, and I'm going to come up and over and up and over until I get to here. And again, I want to come up and over. It's a sagittal section for that. And then I'm going to come down the back. And where is the back there? And here's the back for the second one, and here's the back for the third one. Up and over, up and over, up and down. There's the sagittal section. Okay, and now I'm going to do a transverse section, which is going to be at a 90-degree angle here. This one has a lot of transverse sections already put in place. Like this is essentially a transverse section. This is another transverse section. I could put another transverse section if I come up this far and I go back to the back and I come up the same distance, and I can tell if it's the same distance by if I'm in perspective. Transverse section. Okay, so we've got sagittal, transverse, and now I want to do a coronal section. Up and over and up and over and up and over and up and over and up and over. Increasing the contour, working on the contour to make it feel more frosted. Okay. So there's the cupcake expressed with our 3 new tools. Let's talk about maybe let's talk about an object that might be a little bit more difficult. Like, for instance, if we wanted to talk about the table. The table has very similar shapes. What if we wanted to talk about the Volkswagen? So let's say we wanted to build the Volkswagen bus. So here's the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to sculpt a cube at about the correct proportions. Those are my x's, and I want to line up my x's. Those x's look pretty good. I'm going to call these the z's. Z, Z, Z. Okay, now here's an easy place for me to make a mistake. Here's my first y. There's the second y. There's the third y. Okay, I did pretty good. Okay. This, an x, this, an x. Okay, now I want to do my invisibles, and it looks like I've got a little bit of a party hat on this. These don't feel like they would be converging. The back end here doesn't feel like it's converging. Okay. And I can see again, you see the way that these two are becoming bigger? You see the way that this space and this line and that line are creating a bigger space there, which means I've got a mistake on my hands. That means that this line, it should be staying the equal distance from, and there we go. So I solved it. But in solving it, I've made a line that's essentially an invisible line, overly dominant. And so I'm going to erase it back. So here's the visible line. Here's the visible corner. This is invisible work right in here. This is work that's for FYI. It's for my information. It's not for the public. The public doesn't need to know about it. I might want to double check these, and I was feeling especially suspicious of that one. Okay. Now I've got a lot of different ways that I can go about shaping this box. Okay. So one of the ways that I can start to shape it is I could say I want to pull the middle out. If I want to take this part here and have it come just a little bit of a projection, I can go like this. I can find the center of it. Here's my center finding mechanism. And this center finding move is something that at first it's hard to get kind of good at it. It takes a little bit of practice before it's actually a useful tool. But then in a little bit it becomes extremely useful. Okay, so what happens is we could say about the center, the van goes like this. Okay, and on the top, the same thing happens at about the center, only at the top it's less, right? So here at the top, I want to bring it out less. And now another thing happens, which is that at the top of the van here, the top of the van, if I find the center of this space here and there, okay, here's the center. See how I find the center? I always find it the same way with an X. Okay, so I found the center, and I know where this center is. Okay, so this guy goes like that. And this guy goes like that. I just brought it up the same amount. Okay? And if I want, I can connect them. And now I'm going to connect them, and I'm going to draw the sagittal section. So here I'm drawing through, and at this point I curve down. Okay, you see I'm curving to shape the top of the van. I'm going to come outwards for the windshield, and then down to this point. And here's my outer contour. And that's the sagittal. And we can cross the entire van here down the middle. It's good practice. And then we'll do a transverse section. Here's a transverse section, which actually, if I do a nice job, like I can come up, I'm going to use the transverse section to show me where all the windows are. I'm going to come down a similar distance on all of these. I want to mark these and drop down a similar distance. And I want to do a transverse section. Okay. There's my transverse section. Okay, and you see how we're starting to get the van? Okay, and the coronal section would go this way. We would be one like this, and we'd be looking to stay in perspective. And the coronal sections on the van become the places where we have windows of this, on those windows, okay? And so you can start to see this thing becoming lots more interesting and complicated. Okay, nice work.